While the world watches explosions lighting up the skies over Tehran and Tel Aviv in June 2025, there's a story that's been decades in the making, one that involves secret alliances, betrayed friendships, and a transformation so dramatic that former allies became mortal enemies almost overnight. What if I told you that Israel and Iran were once the closest of allies? That Iranian pilots flew Israeli jets, that Israeli military advisors trained Iranian special forces, and that Tehran was one of the first nations to recognize Israel's right to exist. Today, we're going to trace the real roots of this conflict, and what you'll discover might completely change how you understand what's happening right now in the Middle East. This isn't just about recent missile strikes or nuclear facilities. This is about how geopolitics, revolution, and betrayal created one of the most dangerous rivalries on Earth. The story they don't want you to know begins not in 2024, but in 1979, with a revolution that changed everything. Let's go back to a time that seems impossible to imagine today, when Israel and Iran were strategic partners. From 1948 to 1979, these two nations shared what Israeli officials called a peripheral alliance. Here's what most people don't know. Iran was actually the second Muslim-majority country to recognize Israel, doing so just 1 year after Israel's independence. But this wasn't just diplomatic courtesy, it was strategic necessity. Both countries faced the same enemies. Iran, under the Shah, was surrounded by Arab nations that viewed it with suspicion because of its Persian heritage and Shia Islam. Israel was surrounded by Arab nations that refused to accept its existence. The enemy of my enemy, as they say, is my friend. The cooperation went far deeper than anyone realizes. Israeli military advisors helped train Iranian special forces. Iranian pilots flew Israeli-modified F-4 Phantom jets. Iran provided Israel with oil during the Arab oil embargoes of the 1970s. There was even a secret pipeline project, codenamed Eilat Ashkelon, that allowed Iranian oil to flow through Israeli territory to European markets, but perhaps most telling was Operation Flower. This was a joint Israeli-Iranian intelligence operation in Kurdish Iraq, aimed at destabilizing Saddam Hussein's regime. Israeli Mossad agents and Iranian SAVAK operatives worked side by side, sharing intelligence and coordinating attacks against their common enemy. The relationship was so close that when the Shah visited Israel in 1977, he was treated not as a foreign dignitary, but as a brother in arms. Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin called Iran Israel's best friend in the region. Within 2 years, they would be sworn enemies. What happened? February 11, 1979. The Shah of Iran flees the country, and Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini returns from exile to establish an Islamic Republic. But here's what the history books don't tell you: the revolution's anti-Israel stance wasn't immediate or inevitable. In the early days of the revolution, there were moderate voices within the new Iranian government who wanted to maintain the relationship with Israel, just on different terms. Some revolutionary leaders even suggested that a new Iran, freed from American influence, could be an even better partner to Israel, but Khomeini had other plans. And here's where the untold story gets interesting. Khomeini's anti-Israel ideology wasn't just about Palestine or Islamic solidarity. It was about creating a new identity for Iran that would unite the country's diverse ethnic and religious groups behind a common cause. By positioning Iran as the leader of the global Islamic resistance against Israel, Khomeini was essentially creating an external enemy to consolidate power internally. But there's a secret that Iranian hardliners don't want you to know. Even after the revolution, some cooperation continued. Through intermediaries in Turkey and Switzerland, Israel and Iran continued limited intelligence sharing about their common enemy, Saddam Hussein's Iraq. When Iraq invaded Iran in 1980, starting the Iran-Iraq War, guess who secretly provided Iran with military equipment and spare parts for their American-made weapons systems? Israel. This secret cooperation continued throughout the 1980s, even while Iranian leaders publicly called for Israel's destruction. It only ended when the real transformation began, when Iran decided to build a nuclear program. Here's where the story gets truly complicated, and where most analyses get it wrong. Iran's nuclear program actually began in the 1950s under the Shah with U.S. support. Expanded in the 1970s, paused after the 1979 Islamic Revolution, and resumed secretly during the 1980s Iran-Iraq War. But here's the part they don't tell you: Israel initially wasn't worried about Iran's nuclear program. In fact, some Israeli officials in the 1990s viewed Iran's nuclear ambitions as a potential balancing force against Arab nationalism and Saddam Hussein's Iraq. The real turning point came in the early 2000s, when two things happened simultaneously. First, undeclared enrichment sites at Natanz and Iraq were exposed in 2002, revealing that Iran had been secretly developing nuclear capabilities far beyond what they had declared to the international community. Second, and this is crucial, Iran began developing what Israeli intelligence called the Ring of Fire, a network of proxy forces surrounding Israel. Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, Shia militias in Iraq, and Houthi forces in Yemen. All funded, trained, and equipped by Iran. This wasn't just about nuclear weapons. This was about Iran creating the capability for a coordinated, multi-front war against Israel using proxy forces, while holding the nuclear option in reserve. But here's the secret that changes everything. According to intelligence sources, Iran's nuclear program isn't just about Israel. It's about regional dominance. Iranian leaders calculated that with nuclear weapons, they could dominate the Persian Gulf, challenge Saudi Arabia for leadership of the Islamic world, and force the United States to treat Iran as an equal power. Israel just happened to be the most immediate threat to those ambitions. What most people call the Israel-Iran conflict has actually been a shadow war that's been raging for over 2 decades. The two sides have been attacking each other, mostly quietly and in Iran's case often by proxy, while avoiding a full-blown war, but the scope of this shadow war is breathtaking. Israeli attacks have targeted Iran's nuclear program, with Tehran believing Israel and the US introduced the Stuxnet computer virus in the early 2000s to target the centrifuges enriching uranium. Iranian nuclear scientists began dying in mysterious car bombings and assassinations. Explosions occurred at Iranian nuclear facilities with suspicious regularity. Meanwhile, Iran was building its proxy network, moving weapons through Syria to Hezbollah, and developing increasingly sophisticated missile technology. Here's what intelligence sources won't tell you publicly: both sides have been preparing for this moment for years. Iran has been building underground missile cities and hardening its nuclear facilities. Israel has been developing bunker-busting weapons and long-range strike capabilities specifically designed to reach Iran. The shadow war became a real war not because of October 7th or Gaza, but because both sides finally decided that the cost of restraint had become higher than the cost of confrontation. Now we come to today, and the escalation that has the world holding its breath. On June 12, 2025, Israel launched several airstrikes against Iranian nuclear facilities and infrastructure, marking a dramatic escalation in what had been primarily a proxy conflict. But here's what the news isn't telling you: this wasn't a spontaneous escalation. Intelligence sources suggest both sides have been preparing for this moment for months. Israel's military strikes are likely to set back Iran's nuclear program, but much of the program will remain. The real story is about timing. Why now? 3 factors came together. First, Iran's nuclear program had reached what Israeli officials called the point of no return. They were within months of having enough enriched uranium for a weapon. Second, Iran's proxy network had been significantly weakened by Israeli operations against Hamas and Hezbollah. Third, the change in U.S. administration created uncertainty about American backing for Israeli operations. Recent explosions in both Tehran and Tel Aviv show this conflict has moved from shadow war to direct confrontation, with targeted military and nuclear facilities being impacted, resulting in deaths of Iranian military officials and nuclear scientists. But here's the secret both sides don't want you to know: neither Israel nor Iran wants a full-scale war. Both are hoping that limited strikes will force the other side to back down. The problem is, both sides have also painted themselves into corners where backing down looks like weakness they can't afford. So what's the untold story behind the Israel-Iran war? It's not really about Islam versus Judaism, or even about Palestine. It's about two regional powers whose alliance turned to rivalry, whose cooperation turned to competition, and whose shadow war has finally emerged into the light. It's about how a revolution in 1979 transformed the Middle East strategic balance. It's about how nuclear ambitions and proxy networks created a spiral of conflict that neither side seems able to stop. And it's about how two countries that once shared intelligence and oil pipelines now find themselves on the brink of a war that could reshape the entire region. The real tragedy isn't just the current violence, it's that there was once a different path, a path where these two ancient civilizations were allies rather than enemies. Understanding that history doesn't just explain how we got here, it might be the key to finding a way back from the brink. What happens next will depend not just on military calculations, but on whether leaders on both sides can remember that enemies can become allies just as surely as allies can become enemies. History shows us that in the Middle East, today's impossible alliance might be tomorrow's strategic necessity. The question is, will they realize it before it's too late?